a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Rick and Tom for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this fall, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Suzanne Knopfler with Benoit Midetsu on free speech, to Ketsu Medita about the benefits to countries who receive immigrants, our first civic cocktail of the season, presented with City Club, featuring Denise Juno, Adrian Diaz, and Harriet Walden, and more. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the event cancellations and ever-changing landscape. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation by clicking on the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. You can make a donation online or text Town Hall to 44321 today. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the COVID outbreak and can use your support as well. If you are interested in supporting local independent bookstores by purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase your Elliott book. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A.
Can you turn off the air conditioning, hon?
Rick and Tom will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. You can also vote on which questions will be addressed by clicking the arrow next to the question to upvote it. We cannot guarantee that we will be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civic series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Ground Foundation, KUOW, and Windcoast Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Rick Perlstein is the best-selling author of Nixonland and The Invisible Bridge. His essays and book reviews have been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Nation, and The Village Voice, and Slate, among others. He is a contributing editor and board member of the In These Times magazine. Tom Nestle is the owner of Finney Books. He is an 8-time champion on Jeopardy and former Amazon book editor. He holds a PhD in English literature and has written for the Paris Review Daily, The Millions, and The Stranger. Perlstein's book, Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Rick Perlstein and Tom.
Hi.
Hi,
Am I muted? Can you hear me? You can hear me.
I hear you fine.
Okay, great.
I'm the only one who counts. Like.
Take it away, Tom.
All right, thanks. So I'm in the back of Finney Books. Rick is in Chicago, I assume. And I guess the first thing I want to say is congratulations. This has been a long road. How many years in your own life and how many years in American history?
I began working on this project in 1997. So it's almost half my life, 23 years. I'm 50. And the saga, the first book, Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, begins in the aftermath of the 1958 congressional elections. So we're talking 22 years of history.
Okay.
23 years of history writing.
Yeah. And was this always the plan, 58 to 80?
It was. I don't know quite how it formed in my mind, but I read Taylor Branch's Martin Luther King series.
Yeah.
And I think that something like that began forming in my brain when I started thinking about writing a book about the rise of the right in the 1960s. Yeah.
But one of the fascinating aspects of the project is, unlike Taylor Branch writing about King, you're not writing about your heroes politically.
Right. I'm not.
Yeah. And we can get into this. I mean, I think one of the things that I think is fascinating about the books is the way you often can't tell Um, And was that something you had in mind from the beginning also?
Of not being able to.
Well, that you were going to present this in a pretty even-handed. There's definitely someone from the left writing the history of the right. Could be done in a very different way.
Well, I think that my perspective is sort of ethnographic, right? So that I'm trying to write about a culture that's foreign to myself, right? When I kind of look back into the prehistory of how I got interested in this subject, I think of as a kid, waking up early on Sunday mornings and for some reason ending up watching TV preachers, in thick Southern accents, talking about the blood of the lamb and being absolutely riveted by the idea that America had all these tribes, right, that were completely foreign to me. And then when I got closer to thinking about this sort of project, I became much more interested in political history in 1994, when Newt Gingrich's, revolutionaries took over Congress, and I realized that there were just millions and millions of people who saw the world in a different way than I did. Then the next year, I was absolutely galvanized by the Oklahoma City bombing and kind of the rightward fringe of that kind of right-wing shift in American political culture. And so I've always been interested in anthropology too, at the idea of empathetic portraits of people who see the world differently from the way you do, but from the way oneself does. But at the same time, I write as a citizen, so I do think that there's a moral valence to them. I think I don't say this person is bad or this person is good, but I think that I don't hide my hand. When someone does something meretricious or dangerous in my accounts, I'll say so. But I'll say so whether they're a Democrat or whether they're a Republican. I don't necessarily think Jimmy Carter comes out of this one smelling like a rose either. So,
yeah.
The truth is, I see it without fear or favor, and devil take the hindmost.
Yeah. And I remember when the first book came out, I think you got a lot of praise from the right.
I did. They were very happy that someone was paying attention to this neglected history, I think.
Yeah. Has that continued through the books? Do you sense you've had that same reception?
Not so much. I think that, if anything, I was a little too, I'm not going to say respectful, because I respect all my subjects, but let's say I took for granted their own self-representations a little bit more than I do now. And one of the things they talked about was that they were these underdogs, that they were completely martyred by the forces of, the dominant political culture. And I think that was a little bit, as we all kind of appreciate now, is a little bit performative, shall we say. And when you're writing about, Richard Nixon and the fact that so many people on the right began to look at Richard Nixon almost as a role model. I once wrote about a right-wing activist who said to me that I didn't admire Nixon until Watergate. This was kind of an owning the lib kind of thing, right? Yeah. And then as I, kind of wrote about a lot more of the consequences of once, conservatives began to gain a little bit more power in American life and began writing a lot more journalism about those consequences. I think that some people on the right have remained respectful interlocutors, which was kind of like a culture on the right among kind of an older generation. They were a lot more kind of comfortable of kind of, hanging out with liberals and being fascinated by people who are fascinated by politics. It's a lot more different now. I think the kids are a little more kind of cutthroat and a little bit more insular when it comes to that sort of thing. But I think that my readership and fan base on the right, it's fair to say, is pretty slim these days. Which is fine. I don't care who reads me.
Yeah. So let's set the stage for Reaganland. It opens. So after the '76 election,
Right.
Reagan has
flashes back to the 1976 election too. I would say it opens after the timeline, shall we say, to use a popular phrase these days, starts with Ronald Reagan losing the 1976 Republican nomination to the incumbent president, Gerald Ford.
But he ran this surprisingly successful insurgent campaign.
He took it all the way to the convention. Conventions used to take place, it was rather frequent until really the 1980s, that you didn't necessarily know who the candidate was going to be until the convention was over. And the 1976 Republican convention was probably the last one. No, there's the 1980 Democrat convention.
I was going to say that the book is kind of framed by two of those conventions.
Convention in very similar fashion,
Right.
had fewer delegates, but tried to force a rules fight in both cases that would possibly shake loose enough delegates to a Hail Mary pass, shall we say, to carry things out in the last inning. So that's when it starts. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to jump ahead to 80, like it is fast. I'm not sure I'd ever, until we were just saying that, picked up on the parallel that, the Kennedy and Reagan, and then they both kind of felt like they emotionally won those conventions.
That's right. Speeches that left the delegates in tears.
Right.
And, the incumbent president kind of looking like very kind of limp and not particularly interesting. I think the bigger picture on that is when you pull back and look at the big shifts in political culture in the 1970s, the growing distrust of institutions and kind of much more kind of individualism and a lot less deference to the powers that be as a product of the 60s and, the loss in Vietnam and Watergate and the idea that kind of party organizations were old-fashioned and not to be trusted.
Well, let's talk about organizations, because on the face of it, the big character, they're the two guys on the cover of your book, Carter and Reagan. They're the main characters, but one might argue that the main character, or a main character to use, is Richard. I don't even know how to say his name. Richard Viguerie. Is that how you say his name?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, he and standing for a certain group of people, but in your story, he really comes across and what he represents as the real story running underneath all the headlines.
Let's talk about this guy. So Richard Viguerie was known as the godfather of the New Right. And the New Right is a phrase people use not quite accurately, referred to something very specific, which was a group of cutthroat kind of Republican operatives that came to the fore in the mid-1970s. They were very, like we say, anti-institutional, had contempt for the leadership of both parties. And as far as conservatism went, they thought that the people running the Republican Party were this kind of out-of-touch country club elite. And they were really the first conservatives who talked concertedly about reaching out to middle class and lower middle class, kind of rural, alienated white Americans in much the way Donald Trump does now. And they shared an ideology with the previous generation of conservatives. They certainly all came of age in the Barry Goldwater crusade in 1964. But Barry Goldwater made his appeal to the electorate by saying, I'm going to make Social Security voluntary. I'm going to get rid of the Tennessee Valley Authority and sell it to private industry. I'm going to get rid of farm subsidies. All these radical economic ideas that, of course, completely fell flat with the electorate. Oh, and by the way, he said, I'm going to push the Soviets to the wall, and if it leads to a nuclear war, we're man enough to take it too, right? These guys were a lot more cunning. What they did was they said that their method was organizing discontent. And what that meant was they would kind of scan the political horizon and find things that basically were pissing people off. And whatever that was, they would use that as a wedge to get these people into the conservative coalition by kind of magnifying their hatred of liberalism using the most emotional appeals possible. And the best way they found to do that was, as one of them put it, that he said, sex is the Achilles heel of the liberal Democrats. So they were fascinated by the idea of weaponizing opposition to abortion, weaponizing opposition to feminism and how it's a kind of transforming family roles, weaponizing hatred, fear, absolutely feral anger at gay rights and homosexuality. A lot of these guys were former segregationists who just kind of seamlessly transformed their anger at civil rights activists into anger at gays. And the long story that I tell over the 4 years in the book is that the activists led by Richard Viguerie, pioneered very brilliant new techniques of reaching voters, like direct mail, which was kind of like the kind of email forwards or Facebook manipulation of 1980, 1978, 1976. Richard Viguerie had been a staffer of the conservative youth group Young Americans for Freedom. And after the Goldwater election, he had the idea to go to the clerk of House of Representatives, which was where campaign law then in place, reposed all the addresses of everyone who gave $50 or more to the Goldwater campaign. And he had what were then called Kelly girls, what we now call temps, just basically descend upon this office and start scrawling down names and addresses of Goldwater supporters. And before they got kicked out, they had 10,000 names. And this 10,000 names, he said, were basically his bricks, gold bricks in his political Fort Knox. And those became the foundation of these massive computer data banks of people who would receive these letters about how the liberals want to take your guns away. The liberals want to teach your children that homosexuality is okay. The liberals want to force you out of the home if you're a woman and into the workplace. And this stuff was going on completely under the radar of the political media. And these guys kept on winning elections, and no one knew what was happening until they figured out. Richard Viguerie said direct mail is like a water moccasin, silent but deadly. And the thing that makes this so important in the evolution of the Reagan story is that Richard Viguerie realized that if he could weaponize a certain block of leaders and voters, that they could kind of lock in these political gains forever. And that block of voters was evangelical and fundamentalist Christians who had not really been involved in politics because politics was seen as this worldly thing that kept your eyes off, the real goal, which was getting into heaven. And around these very emotional social issues, around issues like abortion, around issues like gay rights, they became one of the most fearsome organizing forces in American politics and turned millions of Americans who had never been involved in politics before into political activists. And, the most famous leader was Jerry Falwell, whose son was
funny that
jammed up. No one who reads my book will be surprised about anything wicked, meretricious, hypocritical, violent, chicanery that any Christian right person does. Pat Robertson was one of these guys, and he said that God would much rather have a crook in charge and law and order. A crook and stability is much better than a morally pure person and instability. So that was his way of explaining why he was perfectly willing to go to the wall against Jimmy Carter.
Yeah,
Jimmy Carter was with these forces of liberalism, and he'd given an interview to Playboy magazine, and he was, even though he was a Southern Baptist, he was definitely in league with the devil.
Yeah, I mean that. This is the first of your books that I felt like I had really lived through. So it was interesting to see where I was. I was kind of a political junkie, and by age 10 or 11, I was following all this stuff. And so it was interesting to see where surprises for me came up. And one was that Carter had a lot of evangelical support when he was first elected. Right.
I have a scene when I'm in the first chapter when I'm describing this 1976 showdown between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, in which Gerald Ford's campaign team is meeting in the office of a fellow named Mr. Cheney, who one of the guys notices has a man-sized safe in the corner. And the pollster, a guy named Robert Teeter, is talking about all this statistics about how, 50 million Americans are born again. And everyone's kind of giggling and tittering and saying they need to draft Oral Roberts, the faith healer, as their candidate. He says, "Don't laugh. This is absolutely serious because these guys have their own precinct organization. These are the churches, and this could be the most powerful force in American politics." And Jimmy Carter is plugged right into it because he was a very out and proud Southern Baptist evangelical. He still teaches Sunday school. He did a mission in the South Bronx in the 1950s. The thing about it is he was a traditional Southern Baptist, in which kind of wearing your faith on your sleeve and bringing it into the public square was anathema. And one of the fascinating kind of monkey wrenches in that 1976 election, and you can read more about it in a piece I did on the Smithsonian website, is that he was much more interested in reaching out to all these different liberal constituencies. And that's why he agreed to do an interview with Playboy magazine.
Right.
And the fascinating thing about this interview in Playboy magazine is it's really the richest, deepest, most thoughtful, most illuminating portrait of a presidential candidate's thinking that I think has ever existed in American politics. But unfortunately, in the context of a very thoughtful, subtle theological discussion in which the interviewer asks him if him and his wife Rosalind are afraid of him being assassinated, and he says no, because he's washed in the blood of the Lamb. And then he says, by the way, that doesn't mean I'm going to be knocking down your door to see if you're fornicating, because I don't believe in bringing my faith into the public sphere like that. He gets into this very subtle analysis of the Christian doctrine of sin and redemption. And the way he illustrates it, speaking of Jerry Falwell Jr., who honors this in The Breach, is that he says, I have lusted in my heart many times, but I know that I've asked for forgiveness and God forgives me, right? Right. Perfectly reasonable theological discussion. The press pounces on this.
That's all I remember from that.
The campaign trail is lust, 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 and everyone's mocking Jimmy Carter. And this gives all these evangelical leaders, including Jerry Falwell, who's taken off the air in 100 cities because he gives such a political sermon against Jimmy Carter, and Pat Robertson, and a bunch of others, an excuse to decouple their flocks from loyalty to Jimmy Carter. Gerald Ford takes advantage of it. He gives he appears in the church of a massive church, 10,000 seat church of this Dallas minister named W.S. Criswell, who is most famous for saying that if John F. Kennedy became president in 1960, the Vatican would, take over take over the White House. But by the late 70s, all these sort of Orthodox Christians, whether they're Catholic or Mormon or Protestant evangelical, are realizing that they have to get together on the same page and fight things like legal abortion and gay rights. They even come up with a theological word for it, co-belligerency. Who cares if they're going to hell? Let's fight together now. Yeah. And Jimmy Carter, by 1980, is an enemy of these people. And 1979, Richard Viguerie and Jerry Falwell get together and they form this organization called the Moral Majority. Jerry Falwell is no less honest than his son. He had been involved in a massive scam to defraud his donors and reached a settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He said God had intended it for him so he could get his books in order. He was a scumbag. But he mobilized this constituency that had never been involved in politics before. Mm-hmm. And the results are before us.
I think for anybody going back to these years, seeing what the landscape of who was a Republican, who was a Democrat, those parties still seemed like they had large ideological,
they were pluralist parties, right?
Yeah, both of them.
Conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. Yeah. But this really is the inflection point in which they're really sorting themselves out in the conservative and Republican camps. So all the 12 candidates who are running, trying to win the Republican nomination going into 1980, because Jimmy Carter by that time is, seems like a sitting duck. All of them are running as conservatives except for one. The one is this odd guy named John Anderson, who feels so unwelcome in the party that after he, starts losing primaries, he decides he's going to become a independent, and he gets on the ballot in all 50 states. And his biggest supporter is Walter Cronkite. He loves him. Walter Cronkite, a rumor swirls around that Walter Cronkite has been asked to be his vice president. And there's a joke that if Volvos could have voted, John Anderson would have been the president. So he was kind of like the candidate for kind of these, high-minded, kind of, he probably had some good support in Seattle, probably in Portland, people who fancied themselves above, kind of the hurly-burly of partisan politics.
The rational voter.
Rational voter.
Yeah.
That's right. And you know, his big campaign promise was a 50-cent per gallon gas tax.
Yeah, you can watch in those 4 years the people getting picked off on both sides, you know, in House races and Senate races.
They're beginning to shift into the Republican Party. You begin. It's interesting that I think if we study American history, we know about the Southern strategy, right? We know that Richard Nixon decided that the way to, you know, to guarantee the fortunes of the Republican Party was to reach out to conservative, racist voters in the South, right? But in 1976, when Jimmy Carter wins, people are like, well, that was a great idea, but that lasted 8 years, and now what we need to do is run these Southerners, and they can run the table in the South, and people can, you know, because the Republicans like never won electoral votes in the South, right? Because the Republican Party was Lincoln's party. They were the party that was, you know, like empowering African Americans, right? And there was still that kind of antipathy, that almost a phobia of Republicans. But you know, lo and behold, Southern Strategy 2.0 is only organized around race kind of implicitly. The real explicit appeal is to these, you know, Southern evangelicals. And so you begin to really see people like the Trent Lotts, Thad Cochran's, Jesse Helms is, you know, one of them, and Strom Thurmond was the early adopter. He became a Republican in 1964. So it's very hard to argue that the Republicans and Democrats are diverse multi-ideology coalitions by the end of the 1980 election. So that's one of the stories the books tell.
Yeah, that was because it does feel like race in these years played a lesser role, at least on the surface. Yeah, subconsciously.
And Lee Atwater, of course, is a character, right? Lee Atwater was the cutthroat. He was one of these kind of, you know, new right inflected people who kind of came out of the, you know, Nixon Watergate world. His partners in crime, with whom he formed a consulting company during the 1980 election, were Paul Manafort and Roger Stone.
Yes.
And Lee Atwater ran Ronald Reagan's 1980 primary in South Carolina, which was like the state where all the nastiest cutthroat politics happens. And he would do things like he ran a Ronald Reagan commercial that made it seem like William F. Buckley was endorsing Reagan because William F. Buckley's brother lived in South Carolina. He sounded exactly like William F. Buckley. But Lee Atwater is the guy. This is when Lee Atwater gives this famous interview in which he says, you can't use the N-word anymore because that'll cause a backlash. And in fact, even when Reagan gives this famous speech in Mississippi at the Neshoba County Fair to kick off his campaign, and he says he's for states' rights, which was a traditional kind of Southern code word, that actually caused a backlash. And He didn't actually do that well in Mississippi. No one wanted to think that they were a racist by then. This was the era of colorblind conservatism. I mean, when you read documents in the 1960s, people will say, I am a racist. You know, I love white people. You know, I hate black people.
As they do now again.
Right? But Lee Atwater gives this famous interview that next year in which he says, well, now you just kind of make it more abstract. You talk about taxes. You know, you talk about good schools. And that's where you get into, you know, kind of the dog whistle politics. So race is obviously still there. But the kind of, you know, murderous rage that you heard in the 50s and the 60s in the South towards African Americans, you hear now towards gays and lesbians. So Jerry Falwell, you know, intervenes in a big gay rights fight in Miami County, Dade County in 1977. A famous orange juice pitch woman, Anita Bryant, you know, is leading Save Our Children. And Jerry Falwell gives a speech there in which he says,